Okay. There we go. So it's a pleasure to be with you all. And what we're going to talk about today is connectivism. What is it? How to apply it? Um, and basically what it means for you. So we've got a ton of content. These slides will be available later, so you don't need to worry about remembering all of the content. That's not what this is about. It's not what connectivism is about. So we're going to take it from there. Sorry, I'm just there. That's better. That's what I want. All right. Okay. So uh, the objective in this session is to present the core ideas of connectivism in both a knowing and a learning context. So I'm talking about both knowledge and learning. And in a sense, using connectivism to unify or bring together the ideas of discovery, interaction, and education. That's a mouthful. That's an awful lot of stuff to try to do in 1 hour. Obviously, we're going to skip through some subjects, but again, this is about getting the overall idea. So here's the plan. We're going to look at what knowledge is briefly. Going to look at what connectivism is, and we'll bring these two ideas together to talk for a bit about how we actually learn. And that's where connectivism is. I'm pointing to the how do we learn with my finger. And then from that, we're going to draw out some implications for practice. So with respect to knowledge, the proposal of connectivism is that the core idea of education or learning or a science, broadly conceived, is to learn a discipline is to become like a practitioner of that discipline. It's not to learn a whole pile of facts and knowledge, but it's to actually be or become like another person who is already an expert in that discipline. We'll need to expand on that a fair bit in this presentation, but that's the core idea of knowledge. In connectivism, we define knowledge literally as the set of connections between entities. That's pretty vague. In a person, a human being, we're talking about the set of connections between the neurons in our brain. In a computer, we're talking about the set of connections between virtual neurons or digital neurons. In a society, we're talking about the set of connections between people, or maybe people and things, or maybe people and ideas. The idea here is that anything where you have a set of connections between things can know. It can become a thing that knows. And learning for us, for society, for anything, is the growth and the development of those connections. I don't think these ideas are unique to connectivism, but connectivism takes these ideas and transforms them into an approach for learning and discovery, either on our own or in a classroom. So learning on this model is the idea that we learn and grow by becoming connected. And again, there's two senses of that, right? The one sense as people in a society, in a world, in an environment, we learn and grow by becoming connected to other people or things or ideas or concepts or languages or whatever surrounds us. And as well as a person, It's the idea that we learn and grow by developing the network of neural connections in our mind through activities, through experience, through immersion. So this is a goal of both science and education, kind of interestingly. The practice is the of becoming connected. This is the actual application of the theory into a learning context. The practice is what we need to do in order to become connected. And I'll talk about some elements of that. I'll talk about what I call the ARF process model: aggregate, remix, repurpose, feed forward. I'll talk about success criteria, how we know we've developed a network that will be successful in learning. And I'll talk a bit about the critical literacies, the skills and the capacities that we are looking toward as both ways of becoming better learners and as indicators that we have become better learners. So let's begin with the first part. What is knowledge? What it isn't is this building and this statue. So we can think of knowledge as, if you will, a domain of discourse. It's something that we talk about. And in a domain of discourse, usually we're talking about a set of objects, which I'll call A, B, and C, but they might be this cup, this water bottle, oh, fuzzed out, a duck, you know. And then the set of properties they share. It's round, it's square, it's blue, it's annoying, it's bigger than something else, etc. That's the typical way we talk about knowledge. So, what is it then to know things? Well, on the traditional picture, the old European logical positivist in Anglo-American tradition, you take all of the things and all of the properties that they can have, and you organize them into what is called a state space. So you have, here's the picture of that. So you have a thing that is A that could have property P or property Q, etc. It's all very organized. It's all very logical. And then what we count as actuality or reality is those members of the set of possibilities that actually exist. So in the world, an A could be P or Q or R or S, but in our world, it's actually P. A B is Q and R, etc. So we distinguish between all of the possibilities of the world and then the things that actually are the case in all of those possibilities. And that gives us a logic of probability. That gives us a philosophy of science, if you will. Working on this theory, we got the traditional theory of science called the deductive nomological model. And you've seen this before, even if you didn't see the name before. And that's the idea that we see something in the world. We see rabbit tracks, and then we see a rabbit. And we come up with a hypothesis, a generalization about a state of affairs in the world. If I see rabbit tracks, then I'll see a rabbit. And then you go out, you test your theory, you go out into the world, you look for rabbit tracks, and you predict, okay, at the end of these tracks, I'm going to see a rabbit. And that's your test. And if your test is correct, if you actually do see a rabbit, you've confirmed your theory. But if you see something else instead, maybe somebody with sticks making a rabbit track, then you've disconfirmed or falsified your theory. And that's, we are told, is how science progresses. So on this view, known as positivism, knowledge is a generation of general principles based on inference from observations. And you've seen this before. It's the sort of stuff that one of those generalizations. Newton's laws, the first and second, third law of motion, the laws of thermodynamics, any sort of general principle, you know, you're supposed to remember crowds behave badly, is an example of this. Knowledge consists of a set of generalizations. We remember that set of generalizations so that we can apply a generalization in that. If I don't know why I picked rabbit tracks. I'm looking. All right, fine. Problem with this model is that it's wrong. Uh, it works really well in limited circumstances, but as soon as things get complex, this becomes wrong. First of all, you can't reduce the world to a set of entities and properties. The world is way more complex than that. You can't reduce the world to a set of statements about what we observe. The world, again, is way too complex for that. And there's no distinction that we can draw between what we see and the laws of logic that allow us to draw these conclusions to make these. Another way of putting that is that everything we see is what they call theory laden. We don't just have raw perceptions. Anytime we look at the world, it is informed by all the things we already know or think we know or have experienced about the world. And so knowledge, this set of analytical statements, it's more like something really fuzzy. The languages we use, the practices that we undertake, the questions that we ask. Wittgenstein called it a way of life. The German word for it is Weltanschauung, a world view. Or if you want to be more technical and more precise, a model. So to know something is really to belong to a community that knows that thing. As odd as that sounds. But if you think about it, the knowledge of, say, physics is defined by all of the things that all of the people who we call physicists, all of the things that they do, they think, they talk about, that's what knowledge of physics is. It's not a set of principles and a set of experiments. It's all of this knowledge. here on the screen, we have a community. It's kind of hard to define, but it's sort of like an open education resource web development community. It's a bit fuzzy because communities looked at this way are a bit fuzzy. And you can see all the links between the different parts of the community, the things that members of the community think about. So we think about the community and the practice of the community as essentially the same thing. So we have this idea then that knowledge is a network and the community is a network, and the knowledge of a specific domain is the network describing that community. That's the thing with connectivism. It comes down to it's all networks in the end. This isn't just me making it up. If you go out into the world and look for evidence, you see it all over. This on the screen now is a map of the sciences. And it's a map based not on whether they agree on statements or principles or laws of nature or questions or anything like that, but on how they're connected with each other. And the way this particular graph was created is to look at citations in scientific papers. And if you cited somebody in a scientific paper, you draw a line. And the more people cite each other's papers, you can draw these lines thick enough. And eventually you get this diagram here that shows how all of the different sciences, everything from nursing to music to biochemistry to plant agriculture, they're all linked to each other. So how do we explain this? How do we describe how this comes to be? How does it happen in a person? How does it happen in a society? Well, we could say that knowledge is construction. A few weeks ago, I actually talked about that theory. And if you look back into the archives of the Moskowitz micro-learning series, you'll see that talk. And it's also on my website, An Introduction to Constructivism. Now, we get this idea from people like Bas van Frassen or David Chalmers that knowledge is constructing the world out of sentences, propositions, words, systems of language. But the problem with that approach, at least to me, is that it takes us in a roundabout way right back to that idea that we're talking about things and properties of things the way we name them with words. That's not really what knowledge is. We reach a point of decision. And this is what distinguishes, to my mind, one of the things that distinguishes connectivism from constructivism. We could view knowledge as construction, and so it's something that we make intentionally. It's founded in language, representation, in models. Knowledge is something we build, either individually or in social constructivism as a society. But I see in my own experience and in my own thoughts on this subject, knowledge as being something that is discovered. It's discovered in the sense that it's founded in experience, in immersion, in practice. By joining this community of practitioners, trying to do the same sorts of things that they do, and over time, by changing our neural connections, becoming like the members of that community. So if this is what knowledge is, then learning is reorganizing our neural network such that we become like a person who's already an expert in that discipline. So that takes us to connectivism. What is connectivism? Well, it begins with a theory of computer science called connectionism. Connectionism is a way of designing computer programs that can work with fuzzy and ambiguous input data. You put the fuzzy and ambiguous input data into one end, you have a network of connections. I'm pointing at my screen, which is not really helpful, but you have a network of connections, and then out the other end, you generate an interpretation of whatever went in the first place. We can contrast it with a symbol system model-based representation that we construct. That's what we see on the left here. And this is constructed. We've created a mechanism of representing that apple using words. So we'll talk about the origin in an apple tree, the kind of thing that it is. It has a body, it has a shape, has a size, color, taste. It's a kind of thing, a fruit, etc. On the right-hand side, however, we don't have that. What we have is this network of connectivity that defines an apple as the connections between the entities in those networks. And I've kind of tried to indicate that with the layering of the network diagram with the connectionist apple diagram. And these connections are represented with numbers. And that would describe the strength or the weight of the connection. It's a numerical representation of an apple rather than a symbolic representation. And when we show a number of things, when we train one of these neural networks, our representation of our different concepts, say an apple or a pear, is what we call a vector, a series of numbers representing the strengths of the connections or the values of properties of the entities that are connected in this network. But what's important here is that two things. First of all, these individual values don't stand for a property that we would normally think, like roundness, squareness, or whatever. And there aren't just 7 of them. There can be hundreds of them. There can be thousands of them. Way more factors than we would think about as a person. And these vectors can define something as similar to something else. You look at these numbers here, see how the numbers for apple and pear are sort of similar. Compare them to the numbers for bear and wolf. They're very different. The numbers for bear and wolf are sort of similar to each other, but the numbers for pear are not very similar to the numbers for bear, except they rhyme. But that's about it. Okay, you might say, well, how does this apply to me? This doesn't seem to be how I think. Yes, it is. Let's play a game. We're going to play the projection game. Because what connectivism proposes is that this is what you actually have in your brain. These sets of values of properties of your neural connections. And we're using numbers to represent them, but they're actually physical properties. So how do we show that this is the case? Well, let's play the projection game. Try this yourself. What word comes next? Bacon and
Eggs.
Eggs? Probably, right? I'd say so. All right, let's try another one. What word comes next? Wane. You're all in Alberta. There should be only one word that comes to mind. Gretzky. Interestingly, though, if you lived in Las Vegas, you'd probably be thinking Wayne Newton. If you're a film buff, you may be thinking Wayne's World. Okay, how about this one? American. Do you see what's happening here, right? I'm giving you a word. In your mind, that's a vector. And what your mind is doing is coming up with a word that has the most similar vector. In my case, it's American Idol. If I was older, it might be American Graffiti. You may have thought of something different yourself. How about Justin? Well, Canadians are all going to say Trudeau. Americans are probably going to say Justin Timberlake, unless they're really young, in which case they don't know who Justin Timberlake is. One more. Tried and
Tested.
I picked truth. And this is an important thing, right? What Manisha says and what I say is actually different here. We come up with a different concept. And the reason for that is we've had different backgrounds and different experiences. Now, the way we fill what word comes next is representative of our knowledge. Our knowledge is, in this case, it's kind of like social cultural knowledge. The answers that I've given you are specifically the answers that a Canadian, perhaps of my age, might give you. Perhaps not. It's really hard to define. And the actual games, the actual projection games that a community would practice are much more complex than this. And they come in the form of questions. What questions are important to ask? They come in the form of jargon and terminology. They come in the form of images, etc. So in connectivism and in connectionism, for that matter, a concept, traditionally so called, is essentially just a pattern of connections described by vectors in the network. So what's really interesting here is we have a tree, a dog, and a couch. They're all represented in that network somewhere. We use one network to represent many things. And the individual neurons, that's these square boxes here, they don't actually stand for anything. They don't stand for a dog or a couch or anything like that. They're just numerical values. But the connections between them define whether we respond with a dog or with tree or with, I'm looking for my, or with dog or with couch. And the key point of connectivism is this network is learned, or more accurately, grown, developed through practice, reflection, experience, and immersion. We can talk about these networks in many, many different ways. We can talk about them as linked data, which is what they're trying to do in the semantic web. We can talk about them in terms of our own personal learning environments or our own personal learning networks or the communities that we live in, the sorts of things that we recognize. Here, this might be me. It's not me. It's some red-haired guy, but but I recognize all of these images and logos and concepts and these people and these other people and this company. Your personal network is very different. It's through the development of this network that you will be exposed to and have experience in different concepts, ideas, practices, and problems. In connectivism, a course is not an organization of facts. It's not like telling a story or presenting a bunch of content that you need to remember. A course is a network, literally a network. When George Siemens and I built the first massive open online course, this is what we built. This is a drawing that our friend Matthias Melcher created of our course. So a MOOC is a website, not a web. And if I were building a MOOC the way I really would like to build a MOOC, all of these different parts would not be on one single service, but they would be created by different people about different things and then all connected together by all of us. And that's the sort of thing that you see, for example, in a blog network where people write about topics, but they link to each other. It's the sort of thing that we see in a network of scientific publications where they write about topics, but they reference or cite each other. It's the sort of thing that we see in a community where people know each other, talk to each other, talk about each other. Pretty much any place where we have knowledge, this knowledge is distributed. It's not held in one place by one thing or even in one person. It exists across a large number of sources, a large number of places that are interconnected with each other. So a MOOC, instead of seeing a course as a series of contents to be presented, we think of a course as a network of participants who find and exchange resources with each other. So what we did when we built a MOOC is we developed that structure and we seeded it with a few resources. But the MOOC actually came into being when participants joined together with us in this community. And then we used a tool, I used a tool called Grasshopper, to connect them together, to allow people to refer to each other and find each other's comments. So here we come back to the idea of community again, this community of people in a quote unquote course who are talking about similar things, who are creating their own resources, who are linking to these resources, and who are learning together as a community. But what's interesting here, and this is why I have this detour group versus network, they're not learning the same thing. They don't all have the same learning objectives. They have different reasons for taking part in this course, just as, and I see there's a number of people here in this presentation, each one of you has a different reason for being in this presentation. You will want to take away different things from it, and different things are important to you. You have a different objective for being here. And this gives us clues as to the sorts of values or success criteria of a course like a MOOC. in our view, not the traditional content-based course. So now let's look at what learning is on this picture. So we reached this point of decision. We said learning is founded in experience, immersion, practice into this community. And the result of that is that it is something we become. And you might think, well, how does that happen? Right? Why don't we just get some stuff and remember it? I mean, that's what we test for, isn't it? We test for test scores, and we see how well they remember something. Well, part of the argument of connectivism is we're probably testing for the wrong thing as well. If we think we know somebody, if we think that if we can test whether somebody remembers a set of facts, we know whether they are, say, a doctor or a pilot, we figure that's enough. But we know that that's enough. I would never trust a doctor who did nothing but passed the test. I would never trust a pilot who did nothing but pass a test. I want to know that they had experience in the cockpit or in the operating theater before I'll trust them. So I want to know that they learned what they learned through experience, immersion, and practice, and not just being told stuff. Really important distinction. So how does this work? Well, we could talk about this for a long time, but basically the theory behind this describes the creation and the growing of connections between entities. That's what learning theory really is. You may have heard of learning theory as constructivism or behaviorism or instructivism or whatever, but really learning theory is the description of the methods, the forms and methods of creating and growing connections between entities. And there are some common mechanisms at work here. Things that we call associationism, backpropagation, etc. We don't need to get into these details here, and this probably won't help us at this point. The main point is there are mechanisms that we know about that create these connections. And so network learning is the development of these networks, looking at both personal experience and social networks, getting people into these networks. And so learning, using the mechanisms described by learning theory, becomes a matter of practice and reflection. And how this comes out the other end is that we say to know is to recognize something. Now, I know that I said earlier, knowing is to have a certain set of connections. And the way we know we have the right set of connections is that that set of connections is able to recognize the sorts of things we want it to recognize. So you see the distinction here. Remembering, recognizing, two different ways of thinking about learning. And in connectivism, it's recognizing, not remembering. So how do we build that? Well, here's an example of a learning theory that describes the set of connections between two neurons. There are all kinds of parameters that we can play with to shape our learning network. These networks are described by the connections, in this case, on this slide, between individual neurons. Here they are. Here they are being organized. The connections are being formed, and we see out the top the vector that I previously described. Here are some networks. We have two separate networks, maybe your personal neural network and a social network. If a pattern exists in one network, we can say that it emerges, and if there is a pattern in the network that is detected, that is recognized. It's kind of a rough concept here, but the main thing here is that one network can recognize a pattern in another network. What do I mean by that? Well, emergence is the creation of what we might call order out of patterns, order out of chaos. But emergence depends on perception. So here are some examples. Here we have what's called a murmuration of birds. You've probably seen them. They fly around in a flock. It looks like one single connected flock making all of these different shapes as it goes through the air. But really, it's just a collection of 1,000, 2,000 blackbirds. We also see it in art, where somebody draws very simple shapes and forms, but we look at that and we perceive a complete scene. You look at this diagram, what do we see here? Well, it looks like somebody's climbing out of a hole. Or did you notice the woman looking at the person climbing out of a hole? It depends on perception, depends on us seeing the pattern in a certain way. Recognition is the skill of being able to do that. Recognition is seeing something in the pattern in front of us. And this can vary depending on our context, on our background, on our state of mind at any given point. This is a very famous example here. It's called the duck rabbit. We keep coming back to rabbits. But if you look at it one way, here's the bill, right? It's a duck. If you look at it another way, here's the ears, here's the mouth, it's a rabbit. And your mind can go back and forth on that. And that's you picking out or actually experiencing different sets of connections as you look at this phenomenon. So, to wrap things up, what are the implications for practice? What does this actually mean for us in a concrete way in our own educational experiences? Well, to present connectivism in this way is, in a sense, as I said earlier, unifying the ideas of discovery, interaction, and education. They're all part of the same thing. We're not talking about three separate things here. We're talking about one single thing. So one way we can talk about it is method as discovery. To discover something on our account is to be immersed in it, to speak it, to listen to the people speaking in it. You discover a new country, a new city, a new environment. You don't look at it on a map. You don't listen to stories about it. Yeah, you might, but it's nothing compared to actually going there and being in that place. And it's not just passive, right? This is something early scientists recognized. To immerse yourself in the world is to try listening, to try speaking, and for that matter, to try doing things, testing things out. It's not formal and organized the way a logical positivist might do it, but you're still trying to do things. So, how do we know that our network that we're trying to get people to participate in is a well-formed network? Well, again, I could go into a long digression here and talk about what would count as a well-formed network. But basically, the idea is a network is well-formed if it's the kind of network that actually can learn from experience. If it can't learn, then it's just static. It's like a rock. It can't change. Nothing would change it. There's no experience that would change its point of view. But a learning network has properties that allow it to learn. Now, I have a list of these properties. I have 4 properties. Experience might teach us that these are the right properties or that a slightly different set of properties matter. We'll see. It's a matter of experience. One property of the network, though, is that each entity in the network is autonomous. Now, that doesn't mean it's alone, right? That doesn't mean it's, an Ayn Rand, self-sufficient, forget the rest of society kind of autonomy. No. It has its own values, its own objectives, and decides for itself. It's still connected to every other or to many other entities in the network, right? It's still influenced by the experiences that it has, by the signals that it receives from other entities in the network, but it makes up its own mind about things and decides for itself what it will pass on or what it would share with other entities in the network. Diversity. For a network to learn, the members in the network can't all be the same. Because if they're all the same, there's nothing that would cause any of them to change. They're just stuck, static. Everybody's the same. So for a network to learn, the individuals in that network need to be different from each other. And there are many ways, count the ways, it's a good game, that a member of a network, a person in a classroom, a neuron in a brain, can be unique and different from other members of that network. They can be unique in form of roles, functions, perspectives, background, history, physical constitution, whatever. There's a huge range of diversity that goes into creating a network that has the capacity to change and develop based on the varying and diverse signals that one member will send to another. Openness. Again, you think about it. If the network is completely closed, no new members, no new experiences, nothing else is allowed to enter the network, then the network can't learn. There's nothing that would disrupt that network. There's nothing that would cause a change in that network. So for a network to be able to learn, it needs to be open. Membership in the network might be fluid. There aren't hard boundaries. You either are or you're not a member of this community. The types of contents, signals that enter and exit the network can change. New experiences, new knowledge, new discoveries, all of these form part of the input to a network, and being open to this network, this input is what allows a network to be able to learn. And then finally, interactivity. What this means is that the knowledge in the network is created by the interactions of members of the network, not by the transmission of a signal, the specific piece of content from one to another, where you end up with everybody having the same content. No. Everybody has different content. Different people have different thoughts in their minds. Everybody's thoughts are different. And in a community, the knowledge of the community isn't all held in one individual person. It's distributed across that community. If you think about it, no one person knows how to fly a 747 aircraft from Ottawa to Paris. Not that we'd ever see a 747 in Ottawa, but I digress. You need people to build the plane. You need people to fly the plane. You need people to repair the plane. These are all different people. These are all different skill sets. Nobody can do everything. Right? That's very different from a network where one person makes all the decisions and everybody else obeys. Right? the capacity of a network where one person makes all the decisions and everybody else obeys is very limited. It's limited to whatever that one person can know. But the capacity of a network where everybody knows something different is that much greater. And then the pattern of connectivity, for example, flying an airplane from Ottawa to Paris, emerges from the network. For us, as an individual learner, it's a process of being a neuron in the network, in the social network, where our role isn't to try to become everything that the social network is. Our role is to bring in that which is relevant to us, the experiences, the content, the messages, to aggregate, and then to reform these experiences in our own way. And I describe that in two terms: to remix and repurpose. To remix is to bring together content from many different sources. And to repurpose is then to shape that content in a way that's relevant to us. So, for example, if I was researching the history of the Peloponnesian War, I would read a number of different books about that war. So I would aggregate them, I'd collect them from the library, then I'd read them and combine all of their contents into one set of documents. So there I've remixed it, but that's not going to be good enough. I'm going to want to repurpose it to shape what I've remixed and put it in my own words. So I would start writing the history of the Peloponnesian War. Herodotus said this, Thucydides said that, and then the last is to feed forward or to share what I've created. And the sharing is an important part of learning because in the process of sharing, I receive feedback. Minimally, I'll receive a message from somebody else. Yeah, I got it. That gives me a little rush because it's kind of cool that somebody read what I've shared. And it makes me want to share more. But also I get feedback because they might say, well, did you consider this source? Did you consider that fact? Is your interpretation informed by this worldview instead of that worldview? Whatever, right? You get feedback, and now your knowledge of the Peloponnesian War begins to shape and reform according to this feedback. So that's the process. Think of yourself as a neuron in a network. Be the neuron. There's the process written out: aggregate, remix, repurpose, feed forward. So we can represent this as a model. It's a 70-20-10 model, if you wish. The 70-20-10 model of learning and development is 70% experience, 20 social, and 10 in the classroom. That's a very different model than we have now, isn't it? Where most of it happens in the classroom and then you have homework and social. Forget social. But this is a model for connectivism. You see this expressed all over the place. Again, it's not new to me. In corporate learning, for example, they've done studies. You ask somebody who's actually working in a discipline, ask real physicists or real managers or real farmers how they learn. Most of it's through experience. Some of it's through talking to other people, and the last 10% is stuff they learn in the classroom, maybe. It often doesn't even get as high as 10%. So the model of cognition matches that. The 70-20-10 model of cognition. Most of it is recognition. This is what our experience brings us. Some of it is reasoning, which is the social practice of argumentation and discussion back and forth. In educational theory, they would call them discursive models of learning. And then remembering, it's not like you don't need it, but it's not nearly as important as it is made out to be. If you can recognize the situation, then you only need to remember a small fraction of that. Recognition is experience, practice, reflection, creation. Reasoning involves the creation of models, inference, representation, theorizing, and then remembering is just the stuff that we need to use in order to do the rest of this. Really, and I talk about this, I've always talked about it this way. Learning is, in a sense, reading the world. But it's not reading the world like a nice, neat, ordered language like logic and mathematics. It's a messy and complex way of reading the world. There's no one language that describes the world. There's no one set of experiences that describe the world. And it's always, always in how these different languages and these different experiences are connected together. And learning is always, always about how we put these together. I talked in another presentation about the critical literacies that we need to be able to read the world in this way. Literacies, not like the traditional literacies of grammar or of mathematics, but the underlying mechanisms that describe the principles of learning in a connectivist way. Things like pattern recognition, things like deciding what's important, and yes, things like drawing conclusions and making inferences. So that's what I had to say for today. Obviously, this can't be the end of this subject. If this interests you, this is only the beginning. And these notes will be available to you as slides later on, and you might want to go back and reflect through them. But reflect through them, if you do this, not as a body of content to be learned and remembered. I don't care about that. You shouldn't care about that. But rather, use this as a list of practices that you might be able to try for yourself. Practice describing your community. Practice playing recognition games. Practice playing the projection game. And kind of look behind these things. You know, when you expect, so you go out there, you're going to go out there after this presentation, you are going to expect something to happen. I don't know. Maybe you expect that lunch will be ready. Maybe you expect that somebody will be in an office. Ask yourself, why would you expect that? And it's not going to be some rule or principle. It's going to be something very fuzzy, an overall worldview that informs that single projection. Thank you very much. I'm Stephen Downs, and I appreciate the time that you've taken to be with me today, and I hope we have a chance to talk again.